Her name has become a symbol of female power, carved into popular culture by television, novels, and legend. But the real Lagertha, if she existed at all, was something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more fascinating than any scream could capture. She was described as a woman who fought at the front of armies with her hair loose over her shoulders, who kept a bear and a great hound as guardians, who murdered her own husband to claim his title, and who, after everything, faded from the historical record as suddenly as she appeared.
Tonight, we go back to the original sources, to the archaeology, and to the world of 9th century Scandinavia, to ask the question that historians have debated for over 800 years. Was Lagertha real? And if she was, who was she actually?
To understand Lagertha, you first need to understand the world she supposedly inhabited. The Viking Age began around 793 AD with the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery off the coast of northeastern England, and it lasted roughly until 1066 AD. It was an era defined not by mindless violence alone, but by exploration, trade, political ambition, and a social structure that, compared to the rest of medieval Europe, gave women a surprisingly significant degree of legal and social standing. Norse women could own property, they could divorce their husbands, they could inherit land. They managed entire estates and farmsteads while men were away raiding for months or years at a time. This was not equality in the modern sense, but it was a degree of agency that most medieval European women could not have imagined. And it is precisely this cultural context that makes the figure of a female warrior in Norse society not just possible, but historically plausible.
The primary written source for Lagertha comes from a single 12th century Danish historian named Saxo Grammaticus, who compiled a massive work called the Gesta Danorum, or the History of the Danes, somewhere around 1200 AD. Saxo wrote about Lagertha in relation to the legendary Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok, and his account is both vivid and deeply problematic. According to Saxo, when the Swedish king Fru invaded Norway and killed the Norwegian king Sigurd, he subjected the women of the royal household to sexual violence and humiliation. Some of these women, in response, disguised themselves as men and took up arms. Among them was Lagertha, whom Saxo described, and these are his actual words translated from the Latin, as a skilled Amazon, who, though a maiden, had the courage of a man and fought in front among the bravest, with her hair loose over her shoulders.
When the young Ragnar Lothbrok came to avenge King Sigurd, Lagertha reportedly fought alongside him with such ferocity and skill that Ragnar was immediately drawn to her. He sought to marry her, but she set her bear and her great hound upon him as a test. Ragnar killed both animals with his bare hands. Lagertha was impressed, and they were married. According to Saxo, they had 3 children together, a son named Freeleaf and 2 daughters whose names are not recorded. Their marriage did not last. Ragnar eventually left Lagertha for a woman named Thora, described as the daughter of a wealthy jarl, and Lagertha returned to Norway.
But Lagertha's story does not end with the divorce. Years later, when Ragnar was facing a military crisis in Denmark, besieged by enemies and struggling to maintain his position, Lagertha gathered an army and sailed to his aid. She arrived with 120 warships. She fought alongside Ragnar once more, and according to Saxo, it was Lagertha herself who turned the tide of the battle, flanking the enemy from behind and breaking their formation. After the battle, she returned to Norway, where she held the title of Jarl,
a position of significant political and military authority. She then allegedly murdered her second husband, Jarl Sigurd, by stabbing him in the throat with a spearhead she had concealed in her dress, and claimed his title for herself. That is the last we hear of her. So, what do we actually do with this account? The first problem is Saxo Grammaticus himself. He was writing roughly 300 years after the events he describes, and he was a Christian scholar with a particular agenda. He was writing a national history of Denmark designed to glorify Danish kings and justify Danish power. He also had a complicated relationship with strong women. His text simultaneously praises Lagertha's courage and frames her through the lens of the classical Amazon warrior, a Greco-Roman literary trope that Saxo, as an educated medieval scholar, would have been deeply familiar with. This raises a critical question. Was Saxo describing a real woman, embellishing an oral tradition, or constructing a literary character based on classical models? Historians are genuinely divided. Some scholars, like the Danish historian Saxo expert Hilda Ellis Davidson, argued that figures like Lagertha in the sagas often represented real women whose stories were exaggerated over generations of oral tradition. Others, like the Norwegian historian Britt Solli, have pointed to the lack of any corroborating sources and the heavily literary quality of the account as evidence that Lagertha was primarily a mythological construction. The truth, as with most early medieval history, almost certainly lies somewhere between these positions. What archaeology can tell us, however, is genuinely remarkable. Because while we cannot confirm Lagertha specifically, we have undeniable evidence that women in Viking Age Scandinavia did participate in warfare. The most famous case is the Birka Warrior, a burial discovered in eastern Sweden that had been studied since 1878 and was assumed for over a century to be male because of the weapons buried with it: a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, armor, and 2 horses. In 2017, a research team led by Anna Shellström at Stockholm University conducted a full DNA analysis of the skeletal remains and confirmed definitively that the individual was biologically female. She was buried not just as a warrior, but as a high-ranking military commander, with a set of gaming pieces that suggest she held a strategic leadership role. This discovery fundamentally changed the academic conversation about women in Viking Age warfare. She was not alone. Across Scandinavia, researchers have now identified multiple burial sites where women were interred with weapons. Not in every case do these burials conclusively indicate that the woman was a fighter. Weapons had symbolic and ceremonial meaning in Norse culture. But the sheer number and consistency of these finds suggests a cultural reality in which women could hold warrior status. The Old Norse literary tradition also gives us the concept of the Skjaldmær, the Shieldmaiden, as a recurring literary and possibly historical figure. These are women who, for various reasons, the death of male family members, personal choice, social circumstance, took on the role of warriors, often described as equal or superior to the men around them. What would Lagertha actually have looked like, trained like, and fought like if she was real? Based on what we know about Viking Age warfare and the physical evidence from warrior burials, she would have been trained from a relatively young age in the use of weapons. The most common weapons of the Viking Age were the spear, the axe, the knife, and the shield. The sword was expensive and associated with high status. A female warrior of Lagertha's described rank would likely have been proficient with all of these. Viking shields were round, made of wood, with an iron boss in the center, and they were used both defensively and as offensive weapons, used to push, strike, and unbalance opponents. Viking Age combat was not the romanticized choreography of modern television. It was brutal, close range, and deliberately terrifying. Her ships, too, deserve attention. When Saxo describes Lagertha arriving with 120 warships to aid Ragnar, he is describing a naval force of staggering scale. A Viking longship of the period could carry between 40 and 60 warriors. 120 ships would represent a fleet of between 5,000 and 7,000 fighters, larger than most contemporary European armies. Even if this number is a dramatic exaggeration, as many saga numbers are, it describes Lagertha as a commander of substantial military and political power, not merely a skilled individual fighter. The question of what happened to Lagertha, where she went, how she died, whether the archaeological record contains any trace of her, remains unanswered. No burial has ever been conclusively linked to her. No runestone bears her name. The sagas do not mention her after the killing of Jarl Sigvard. She appears, blazing in the historical record, and then simply vanishes. This is, paradoxically, one of the things that makes her story feel more authentic rather than less. Mythological constructions tend to have neat endings. Lagertha's story ends mid-sentence, like the record of a real person whose life simply moved beyond the reach of the sources that survived. Whether Lagertha was a single historical individual, a composite of several real women, or a literary figure shaped from the cultural memory of female warriors in Norse society, the world she represents was real. The Birka Warrior was real. The legal and social standing of Norse women was real. The Shieldmaiden tradition, in some form, was real. And the image of a woman standing at the front of a Viking army, hair loose over her shoulders, is not simply a romantic invention. It is a reflection, however distorted by time and storytelling, of a world where that was possible. In a culture defined by courage, skill, and the willingness to face death without flinching, Lagertha, real or legendary, embodied everything that the Norse world claimed to value most.